No, one of the things that those of us in the pro-life movement have always known is that there was a strong racial element to the motivation behind the legalization of abortion. And so about 3 years ago, we launched an investigation into this. And what we have found, I mean, I've been in the pro-life battle for 30 years. I've been working in it full-time for 23 years. And Alex, I've learned things in the last 3 years that I never dreamed of. I work in this 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And the stuff that we've learned in the last 3 years is mind-boggling. And it is absolutely undeniable now that racism was a primary motivation, if not the primary motivation. Matter of fact, I would go so far as to say it was the primary motivation for the legalization of abortion to begin with. And what we did is we went back, and as you've seen in the DVD, we actually start at the time prior to the end of slavery, when not all white people, and not even all wealthy white people, but a certain select group of super wealthy white elitists began to wonder what was going to happen, or actually worry about what was going to happen when the end of slavery came, because they saw it was coming. And we're talking about in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and up until the mid-1800s. These people clearly saw that the end of slavery was going to occur one day. They didn't know when, but they were very alarmed at what was going to happen. And not from the standpoint of insurrection, which is what a lot of people talk about. The wealthy elite can always insulate themselves from insurrection. That's not their problem. What they were concerned about is the economic impact. For the most part, these are the people, this wealthy elite, this small cadre of wealthy elitists, were the people who had most profited from slavery. They had made billions on the backs of Africans that they had brought in here from Africa. And
it had been Christians that ended that, just like Christians are going to end their murder of babies again. But go ahead.
Absolutely. But they began to wonder what the economic impact was going to be of releasing 4 million people into the economy that they had kept artificially ignorant and unemployable. Basically, if you were black in the 1830s and you were set free, you only had one job skill, and that was to work on the cotton plantation. So what was going to be the impact of this is what concerned them, and their first idea was what's called colonization. They were going to just send all the slaves back to Africa. That failed miserably, even though it was widely embraced in our government. The United States Congress, what most people don't know, is the United States Congress actually funded the American Colonization Society. So it was a very seriously taken concept. It just didn't work. And it's interesting when you start studying these things, Alex. You know, if you put things on a timeline, which is how we started this, we did it like a criminal investigation. We put things on a timeline starting in the early 1800s and continuing up to 2009. And one of the things that you see is every time this small group of elitists tried something and it didn't work, all of a sudden there was something else to try. And it's interesting that when colonization failed is exactly the same moment when there was a new philosophy introduced in the world called eugenics.
No.
The man who actually coined the term eugenics, or the word eugenics, is now today called the father of eugenics. And his name was Francis Galton. His family was extraordinarily wealthy. They had made their money from the slave trade. And he came up with this philosophy called eugenics. And basically what it is absolutely no different than what Hitler did, is the creation of the master race. And he thought that the world could manipulate the human condition to the point that we could do a better job than what God did. Basically, their theory was God did well as far as he went, but we can make it better.
And they really believed this. The Galtons and the Darwins and others were all intermarried, and they'd have like 9 kids, and 8 of them would die, and the other one would be retarded.
Right.
And they still thought, though, this was genius and beauty. So they really believed that they were creating a new super race.
Absolutely. And one of the things, and I knew who Darwin was, and I knew who Galton was before we even started this project. What I didn't know is that they were first cousins. Charles Darwin and Francis Galton were first cousins, and they worked together on these projects. And what you start to see as you start unraveling all of this is that basically Darwin was the philosopher and Galton was the guy who put all this stuff into practice.
He was called the Bulldog.
Right. The eugenicists first started out with a plan that was basically what you might call passive eugenics. They believed that not only were Africans inferior intellectually to whites, they believed they were inferior physically as well, and that unless they had direction from the white community, they couldn't survive. They couldn't live without us.
So they set up the social welfare net and racial hygiene health departments, and that's our CPS and Planned Parenthood today.
That's what it evolved into. That's what it evolved into. And what we do is we take everything on a step-by-step basis, and we connect the dots from the failure of colonization to the success of abortion. And we show all the stages that these people went through, from passive eugenics to positive eugenics to negative eugenics to birth control to sterilization and ultimately to abortion. And it's when you start putting this thing on a timeline, you keep seeing all these things pop up where X fails, and exactly on that time, here's this new strategy. And when that failed, here's this new strategy. And they kept doing that until they came up with the one that worked, which was abortion. Now, and we document things in this video I don't think most people understand or don't know. I certainly didn't know. The eugenics movement had really settled on the idea of forced sterilization as the way they would control the world's population.
34 states had passed that.
Yes, over 30 states had actual eugenics boards, state eugenics boards. Over 30 states had them. The first one was in Indiana. And this is not something that happened just back in the 1910s or the 1920s.
No, this went on to the 80s. Amazing film.
Right.
It covers it all. It takes a snapshot that's in Endgame and blows it way up in full stunning detail. You know somebody who's black who thinks Planned Parenthood loves them and Obama loves them, when he, by the way, doubled the funding for Africa for this stuff? You need to find out the truth. You need to get this film.
There will be more philanthropy, but it's not a case where we passed around a tin cup or had a sign-up list. Anything these people do will be exactly their choice.
I would be almost certain that in India you will see increases in the percentage going to philanthropy increasing over the next decade.
When you're lucky enough to have a great success, then you have a question. Are you going to choose to spend it on yourself? Are you going to choose to have your children start as incredibly wealthy people? Or do you want to give it back to society? And everybody has a choice on this, but all four of us here have decided that making sure the wealth goes back to society is what gives us pleasure. We think it's the best thing actually for our children as well, that they're independent and make their own way.
In investing, I'm looking for things that are almost sure-shot certainties, that where I understand the business very well, where I think the probabilities that I'm correct in my analysis are very high, where I'm going to see the results in a reasonable period of time. In philanthropy, you're tackling the problems of society that are the very tough problems, and problems that have resisted intellect and funding perhaps for decades in the past. You're taking on some very, very difficult problems, and ones where success may be measured in decades rather than in years. But that doesn't mean they don't need to be attacked. I mean, and only philanthropy can do it.
In MAFA 21, we talk about the fact that this eugenics thing, which eventually led to the legalization of abortion. And by the way, in MAFA 21, we talk about how it happened in steps, right? And the latest step is the legalization of abortion. Let me tell you what the next two steps are. Okay. The next two steps are government-funded abortion, and the one after that is government-forced abortion. Those are the next two steps in this process if we don't stop it. Right. Now, we talk about all these ultra-wealthy people, and we talk about the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and the Fords and those kind of people that were eugenicists and funded this thing. And people have this tendency to think, well, that was then and this is now. That was the 20s and the 30s and the 40s and maybe up until the 50s and 60s. Think again. Warren Buffett has started an organization now, and here was an article that was in the Dallas paper just a few weeks ago. He started an organization now to get billionaires to give significant percentage of their wealth into a fund that he's created. He says he is going to raise $600 billion. Now, he started it out by putting $46 billion, no, we're talking about billion, not million,
With a B.
with a B, $46 billion into it himself. Now he's gotten Bill and Melinda Gates, which is no surprise. They've been in the eugenics movement forever. They started Microsoft. They've given billions. Ted Turner, T. Boone Pickens. I would have never thought T. Boone Pickens would become part of this.
My husband's heart is broken, I bet.
T. Boone Pickens is in this deal. George Soros,
the billionaire club.
Ted Turner. They're all committing to this. They're all committing to give at least half their wealth into this fund. A big part of this fund is going to be used, by their own admission, for population control, birth control, and abortion. Currently, there was an article in the New York Times, we have a copy of that here as well somewhere, New York Times a few weeks ago, by a woman named Emily Brazelton, who's a slobbering pro-abort, just championing this guy. And it was revealed in there that Warren Buffett is already, today as we speak, giving $150 million a year to the University of California at San Francisco to recruit and train abortionists.
Oh, my gosh.
$150 million a year. But
here's how they get that $150 million a year. You know, we talk about billions versus millions.
Right.
Well, what Warren Buffett did is donate $2 billion into a trust fund. And then the interest that they raise off of this is $150 million a year that has no fundraising costs associated with it. So it's just pure profit that gets pumped into the Fellowship of Pro-Choice Physicians. I don't think the entire pro-life movement raises $150 million a year.
No way.
But that's
if the amount. I want to start getting some.
No, the entire movement doesn't get $150 million a year, but off of $2 billion, just two, they're able to generate $150 million a year. And he's talking about raising $600 billion.
You know, I was telling my daughter the other day, I said, you know, she's 20 years old, and I said, you know, when you hear these numbers that we hear talked about around, like about the budget, $1 billion and $20 billion and $1 trillion, it's hard for you to keep that in perspective. It's easy to lose. $1 billion is 1,000 million. So what he's talking about doing is putting a trust fund here with $600,000 million. Right? Think about that.
I can't even.
With that sort of money, you can buy cities, newspapers, politicians, countries, islands.
Here's the problem. And they're admitting the large part of it is going into this population control. These are eugenicists.
Yes.
That's what they are. These are the people that took over for Rockefeller and Carnegie and all the rest of them. But think about this, Troy. You said what they can buy. There are 535 members of Congress. They could put $1 billion in $1 billion,
right? $1 billion
into each race, and still have $65 billion left. They would own the United States Congress. With $1 billion, you can get Felix the Cat elected to the Senate, and we'd be better off with Felix the Cat versus some of the people that are there.
Spend anywhere near $1 billion to get elected
as president,
and he was the most expensive president to date.
Right. So this is an extraordinarily dangerous situation. And what bothers me, Troy, and you and I have had some long conversations about this, and I've talked to Johnny about this. Much of the pro-life movement is not even paying attention to this.
Right.
Right now, we can fight this. If they get this fund put together and it starts getting put into the system, once it starts working its way through the system,
right.
I'm not sure we can.
Right. Right.
You know, and I was talking to a guy the other day about this, and he said, well, you're talking about a David and Goliath situation here. And I said, yeah, but let's remember, David won.
Right. David won. Right.
Right. And what we need to keep in mind here, with it, because this looks overwhelming sometimes. Yeah. And I was talking to somebody about this the other day. I was on a radio program talking about it, and this woman called me back after the show. And she said, Mr. Crutcher, if what you're saying is true, if they're doing this, we're done. I said, no.